Good morning. One reply. Did everybody go on the 5K? Is that what the deal is? Let me try again. Good morning. Oh, there are some that are alive. Yes, very good. I'll have to ask Dr. Bigger to forgive me for being dressed the way I am. It's all about forgiveness, right? Okay. So I'm just looking forward to the next part or the next step. I'm just moved by every illustration that I'm hearing. So I'm just going to have a word of prayer and then turn the time over to him. And maybe I should say turn the time over to God to bless us. Let's bow our heads. Father, we just thank you so much for the outpouring of the Spirit in this place. It rained heavy outside, but it's raining heavy inside. So this very important subject of the very core of your character of forgiveness, we need clarity. We need to be able to be used by you to reveal that part of your character, and we need you. Bless Dr. Biggers. He opens his mouth and allow your words to come forth. Bless us all is our prayer in the wonderful name of Jesus. Amen.
Well, good morning to all of you. I'm especially proud and impressed by those of you who went on a little jog or a run this morning. Good for you. Keep ourselves healthy and active, huh? Last night, we talked about, without naming it, the theme of your camp meeting this year, forgiven to forgive. You know, when your conference representatives were in touch with us and they were framing this theme, we talked about that phrase in several different forms. What would it mean if it said, forgive to be forgiven? And after our discussion last night about the Lord's Prayer, that would have fit with what my early understanding was, that God expected me to forgive other people first, and then he would forgive me. So I would forgive in order to be forgiven by God. But as we think about that, it doesn't really fit, does it? That would be earning God's approval. We would be proving to God that we were worthy of his attention. And there's just something that doesn't fit right about that. So we reversed that phrase to talk first about what God has already done for us. He has already forgiven us. When I was in school years ago, I remember having a classmate talk to me about Romans 5, 6, and 7. And the message of those chapters being that Jesus died over 2,000 years ago in order to redeem you and me who were not even alive yet. Jesus did it before we knew who we were, before any of our errors had been committed. God already took care of us. So we are already forgiven. Our challenge then is simply to accept that forgiveness by God and open our arms to his affirmation. And then we forgive as a response to what God has already done. Yeah? It is good, solid Christian theology. So, this morning, we are going to talk a little bit about what participation we as human beings can have in this process of forgiveness. Is there anything we in fact can do for ourselves? Is it all miracle done by God? Or are there some things that we can do, steps we can take to make forgiveness more effective? So, last night we were really talking about forgiveness as a miracle God gives us. Today we talk about forgiveness as an accomplishment. What can we do to help forgiveness happen? Will you please give yourselves permission to raise your hand so I can see you and interact with me? If I say something that is confusing, we'll treat this sort of like a class discussion this morning, okay? And we'll explore together what some contemporary researchers have taught us about this subject of forgiveness. We have thought, we people of faith, for centuries now. We've thought about this subject, but particularly in light of our relationship with God. We haven't paid so much attention to it as far as human relationships are concerned. But in the last about 15 years or so, psychologists and sociologists have begun studying the subject of forgiveness and how it works in human relationships. I've listed here several names of some of those researchers. Robert Enright, as you see, works at the University of Wisconsin. He and his wife did a very interesting study in Northern Ireland. Do you remember about the conflict between the Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, and how a few decades ago now that erupted into violent conflict between those bodies, and there was animosity embedded in those two cultures for centuries? Robert Enright and his wife, who is an educator also, developed a curriculum for grade school students and went to the schools, Protestant and Catholic schools in Northern Ireland, and introduced this curriculum to children to help them learn how to be forgiving of one another. It is charming and delightful to see how well it works even at a very young age. He has also done work, Dr. Enright, in adults as well. So there are some tangible things that his research has contributed to this field. The next person, Everett Worthington, is a believer, a Christian. He is a psychology teacher in Virginia, and began talking about the subject of forgiveness a number of years ago now. He was part of a major research project funded by the Templeton Foundation, and they began investigating the tangible, descriptive, logical aspects of the subject of forgiveness. After he had been immersed in this theoretical study for several years, his mother, who was at the time in her 80s, as I remember it, living independently in her home, was attacked by a man who had broken into her house to rob her, and with a club bludgeoned her to death. And this forgiveness researcher had a personal opportunity, occasion, in which he had to apply the very principles he had been teaching other people about forgiveness. It's a very poignant story. The third person on the list, Fred Luskin, taught at Stanford when we first learned about him. Some colleagues and I were doing a research project at Walla Walla, and we'll talk about that toward the end of our session today. We learned about Dr. Luskin's work at Stanford in what was called the Forgiveness Project, the Stanford Forgiveness Project. He was teaching people in a little workshop how to forgive others, and then measuring whether or not that teaching of those things was effective for them. We asked if he would be a consultant for us on our own study at Walla Walla, which he very graciously did. And then just a couple of years ago, as I was writing I contacted him again to ask if he would be willing to look at the manuscript that Pacific Press ultimately published. He was not only willing, but willing to write a little comment about it that you will see in the book. I told him that I was surprised that he might be willing to do that because his own work, it doesn't have any direct or explicit religious connections to it, whereas what we were working on and what I wrote about is very Christian in its point of view. And he said, no, I think what you are doing is very important and worthwhile, and the religious component of forgiveness is crucial. But I didn't write about it because I didn't want to alienate people for whom religion might be in some way a negative. And I wanted them to learn about the subject of forgiveness without being distracted by their frustration about religion. So Dr. Luskin has continued his research, some at Stanford. He's also formed now a private program that he works with as well. The last one is a more recent researcher who, along with graduate students that he works with, has done some interesting studies which we'll refer to this morning, and you'll see a little bit of the impact of what he's done. So, in the last less than 2 decades, we are learning much more about the scientific and human aspects of forgiveness and added that to what we have known as believers in God for centuries about how our relationship with God works. If you were to Google the word forgiveness, you would find lists of books about that subject. Most of them would be fairly recent ones. A few might trickle back a few decades, but most of them in the last 15 or 20 years. Almost all of those books talk about us as the offended persons forgiving those who have offended us. We are the victims. We want to forgive the perpetrator. Last night you heard me emphasize that my experience was that until I accepted myself as the offender, forgiveness didn't really sink into me. Most of the literature doesn't deal with that flip side of forgiveness. It talks about how we, as the one who has been hurt, can forgive the one who hurts us. And they emphasize that the primary benefit of forgiveness is for the one who forgives, not for the one who is forgiven. So, if someone did something that was offensive or abusive of me, and I forgive them, I'm the one who gets the primary benefit. It is helpful to me. So I make the choice to forgive for my own sake, not just for the sake of the perpetrator. If I refuse to forgive, I suffer all kinds of consequences. And we'll at least name some of those this morning, though we don't have time to elaborate on a lot of them. But significant lists of consequences if you don't forgive people, if you hold a grudge and maintain that frustration and resentment. It eats away at us in some very tangible and measurable ways. Here's what some recent studies are indicating. One of those is that some people forgive more easily than other people. I hinted at this yesterday with Barbara. She is a much more naturally forgiving person than I am. I tend to hold on to things. And I remember what has happened to me. And I am suspicious of people whose word or behaviors I have learned to mistrust. Just this morning I had just that kind of conversation. I've been looking for a replacement to an old computer. I stopped at several Best Buy stores, starting in New Orleans all the way up here. I found an Apple store here, and none of them had the model I wanted. So, I guess I shouldn't have named the names of the store, but since it's out there already, I ordered the computer I wanted from Best Buy. And they said, it's in Pensacola. That's not very far away. We'll have it to you by Friday. Today's Friday, right? This morning I got up, looked at my email, and at 11:47 last night, they sent an email saying, oh, Darold, we're sorry about a delay. And let us know if you're willing to wait for a while for the arrival of your computer. So I phoned them this morning. And the short version of a longer conversation is that they at first weren't sure where the computer was, and then when I suggested that I was leaving and we ought to just cancel the order, they discovered that the shipper had already picked it up, and they couldn't cancel the order, but that it wasn't going to arrive here until next Tuesday. I said, Pensacola is only 3.5 or 3 3/4 hours away from here, for goodness sakes. Why does it take 5 days to get it here? Well, they couldn't explain that to me either. Would you like us to change the address to which we'll send it, and we'll ship it to your home? And Darold, the suspicious person, said, to tell you the truth, I've lost confidence in you, because I had several people tell me it would be here by Friday. So, some people are more naturally forgiving than others. Every time I walk into that kind of store now, I will remember this experience. Isn't that too bad? Kind of carry the burden with me. I'm one of these people, they say, a ruminator who forgives more slowly and is more likely to hold grudges. It's a reality about human nature. Some of us are more that way and some less. So it's part of accepting the truth about ourselves. They've also described, these current researchers, that forgiveness is much more complicated than just deciding to forget about what happened and get on with the rest of our lives. Some of you have heard us in conversation say that forgiveness is not an event. It's a process. You don't just say today, I forgive whoever or whatever, and it's over forever. Usually, those incidents that trigger pain or trauma for us recur. The memories come back, the reminders trigger those feelings again. Similar incidents will resurrect those pains. Even seeing other people who are in similar situations will remind us of our own experiences. So repeatedly we come back to these things. I've, in counseling, worked with several adults who as children were physically or sexually abused. And very often when those people have their own children and their child approaches the age where those things happen to them, their anxiety level will rise, because it's a reminder to them, even an unconscious reminder of the pain that they experienced. So, forgiveness, both in our experience and in the literature, forgiveness calls us to repeatedly reaffirm what we have decided. to go back through the process repeatedly when those reminders resurface and choose to let go again. Oh, my good friend is worried about my computer. Thank you. He told me it was too late to cancel it since it's already been shipped. So I said, what's going to happen when the computer shows up at the hotel and I'm not there? He said, they will send it back to us, and after we get it back, we will refund your credit card payment to your account. Could take up to a month or so, but it'll happen. And I said, this is skeptical Darold, right? And I said, how will I know it will happen? Because I was also told it would be here on Friday, and that there was one in Pensacola, and so how do I know this is going to be the truth? And he gave me the reference number, which I have written down on a piece of paper in my pocket. And I will watch my credit card statement, okay? Does that help you relax? Is it okay if we move on now? You know, those unfinished things is a good example of how if something is not closed off in our mind, it just, even unconsciously and often consciously, is unsettled. And we need to take care of those things, face them, deal with them, rather than just ignore them. Because ignoring them doesn't resolve them. No. Yeah. So forgiveness takes more than just a one-time choice. Yep. And we reinforce that. It does get easier over time, and the process becomes more familiar to us, so that we learn how to do this. It's a habit that we reinforce in our minds. Since I've been doing this, for example, I find that that the length of my frustration when I'm in a hurry to get somewhere on the highway and a very slow, relaxed driver pulls out in front of me, enjoying the scenery on both sides of the highway, and I'm anxious to go, 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 I'm finding that I relax much more quickly now than I did years ago, because by practice we learn to do these things. So we improve over time. Yes, please. Those particular terms I'm less acquainted with, but I do know that I'm primarily an extroverted person. So the sanguine, I think, is the characteristic that describes that. And you'll hear me confess some more of my choleric side as well. I tend to react to things rather than just observe them. Yeah. Does that help you? These words, do you remember yesterday when we read from Paul's epistle to the Colossians? Look at the words in this last statement. Real forgiveness, the researchers say, includes empathy. That is to say, being able to understand and be open to what things are like from other people's points of view. Senator McCain saying that if people were dropping bombs on his farm, he'd be upset too. The other POW saying those who were guarding us, torturing us in prison, were just doing what they were told they had to do, following orders. They're able to see things from the perpetrator's perspective. Empathy, compassion, understanding toward the offender. Those are components that we nurture in ourselves that make it easier to forgive. So, what kind of things happen when we don't forgive? What connections are there? in our lives. Physically, we know now that stress levels increase if a person holds grudges and doesn't forgive. That by and large, people who are forgiving people have lower stress levels. And I'm sure you're acquainted with all the ramifications of stress. Physiologically, it impacts us in very tangible, measurable ways. Anger is a major issue that is directly connected to unforgiveness. People who are angry, and there are ways of measuring that now, what level of anger is there that we carry around with us. People who are angry have a statistically increased level of risk for heart disease. And if they already have heart disease and we measure that, there are poorer outcomes for treatment for those who tend to be angry. That study by those listed at the bottom. And this study, this is by the Toussaint, the last man that we saw on the list of researchers. You die sooner, you shorten your lifespan if you do not forgive. It has a direct impact on the length of our life. We know now too, please.
I find that it works better if you forgive someone before they even ask you.
Oh.
Don't hold a grudge against them.
Yeah.
Forgive me.
Aha. He's saying that he has found that it works better if you forgive a person even before they ask. There are several illustrations. I'm thinking of stories that fit that so well. Yes, we don't have to wait for an apology to forgive someone. And we can process a lot of this without any contact with the perpetrator whatsoever. In our case, for example, the state of Maryland has prohibited us ever being in touch with Anthony. We can't visit with him. We can't talk to him on the telephone. We can't even write letters back and forth to him. So we have had to do that process all on our own, and it still is very effective, very effective. It's very true. So, mentally, what happens to us if we do not forgive? Anxiety level increases, levels of depression are higher, and mental disorders in general are higher among people who hold grudges rather than forgive, let go of those things. The outcomes of our mental health are impacted negatively as well. And those who score high on the forgiveness scale are much more measurably mentally healthy than those who do not. Direct correlations. And if you increase the level of forgiveness, you decrease stress level and mental health symptoms. So you can adjust your own life by making some specific choices in this area. Spiritually, we would assume that there would be some improvements, and there are. Studies show that religious people are better at forgiving than non-religious people. That prayer increases our ability to forgive. And what intrigues me about this study is that it wasn't just about Christians, but it was also true for Hindus and Muslims. That it didn't seem to matter what religious faith you had. If you were a person of prayer, you were able to forgive more effectively. Yes. And our study at Walla Walla focused on whether or not it was helpful to add a religious component to forgiveness training. There are a number of packages. For example, Fred Luskin at Stanford has a DVD set of workshops, and you can listen to those and go through his exercises and learn how to forgive. I mean, it's just a skill that you develop. We wondered at Walla Walla, if you add a religious component to that kind of skills training, does that enhance our ability to forgive? And our pre and post studies, both at the end of the workshop and then about 6 months later, proved that in fact it does make a measurable difference. If you add a religious component to that training, it augments the ability that a person has to forgive. So you may have noticed that Pacific Press circulates DVDs of this workshop that we used in our study. And we did that. We produced that and provided it to Pacific Press. We don't get any return out of it, but as a way for people to either individually or in small groups or in study groups to be able to practice in more detail the exercises that enhance our ability to forgive. So, there are some challenges, particularly for us as religious people, it seems to me, when we approach the whole application phase of forgiveness. And I say, particularly we religious people have these challenges because our beliefs can sometimes complicate our ability to forgive. One of those assumptions is that to forgive is a kind of an opportunity for us to become more like God, to follow our model. And that sounds on the surface like a very good thing. Isn't that what we're supposed to do? We follow the example of Jesus to become God-like. Isn't that the description of what sanctification is like, to become holy? But it suggests then that any failures to do that are the result of our own self-focused, selfish protectionism. We want to be who we are. We don't want anybody interfering with that. And so it tends to foster guilt rather than ongoing effort. That when we mess up, we say, oh my goodness, I'm just so terrible, I can't do this. And we carry this load of guilt with us continually, and that can become a significant problem. And we, at least unconsciously, begin to perceive this opportunity to learn how to forgive other people as a requirement rather than an empowerment. Thus, my misunderstanding of the Lord's Prayer all of those years. I thought it was my job to forgive other people, and then God would forgive me. That my work was what allowed God to do His work. And until I did my job well, God couldn't do His. So I ended up in that false scenario, being in control of God, if you will. That I was the one who had to act first. And then God responded to me because I assumed it was a requirement, an obligation of me to do this. So then forgiveness became my accomplishment rather than God's gift. Do you see the challenge there? So, in practical terms, what is it that makes it difficult for us to process these offenses and let go of them at the end of that process. One of those is the requirement for us to deal with the truth. What is it that actually happened? Regardless of what the pain is in your own life or in those with whom you work or care about, there is often a wish to avoid revisiting those painful experiences. Things that others said or did to you that were hurtful, abuse or neglect that you experienced, assaults that changed your reality forever. We don't like to dwell on those things. We just wish we could forget about them and they would go away. But the process of forgiveness requires us to face reality. And that's true on both sides of the forgiveness equation. For us as victims, it means that we have to face what happened to us. In our case, Barbara's and my case, it is facing the truth that Shannon is gone and that nothing we do is going to change that. For those of you who have been sexually assaulted, it means that you admit to yourself that something precious was taken away from you, forced away from you. Those of you who were physically abused, attacked, have to admit the horror and terror of that experience. Those of you who were betrayed by a friend have to face the truth of what happened. It's not pleasant. And, as you heard from me last night, facing the truth about ourselves, who we are, is no easier. The hard work of dealing with reality is an essential step, and it becomes a challenge because we wish we could avoid that. Second, we have sadness. Things are gone now that we can't recover. And we regret those losses for ourselves or for others. I use the hard word here rather than upset or irritated or even angry. I use the word rage because our anger takes us away from being able to deal with problems. Researchers tell us now that by studying how our brain functions, we know that when we get angry, the brain activity shifts from where we make decisions to where we act out of instinct. And we literally lose control of our lives when we get angry. That anger hijacks our brain and moves us into a survival reactive mode instead of a decisive, thoughtful, choosing frontal lobe mode. You saw the illustration if you were here last night. Here's a second look about what anger can do to us.
Excuse me. I know you didn't think anyone would catch you, but you just slammed your door into my car. The least you can do is say you're sorry, lady. You don't have to take that tone. It's not like I'm hurting your resale value. I'm sorry. See? Like that.
What if spring is late and winter it's a marshmallow world? It's the time for play. It's the little it's a whole year round. Sun is bright, like the pumpkin's head. It's shining so you know it won't freeze. The world is your snowball, see how it grows. Whenever it snows, the world is your snowball, just for a song. So get up and roll it along. It's the only world make the sweetheart. Take a walk with your favorite girl. It's sure take what a spring is late and winter it's a marshmallow world. And winter it's a marshmallow
I don't know what happened.
Scary, huh? To think that human beings could get like that so easily. Rage is a problem. Another problem is our wish for revenge. We want to get back at that person who hurt us. We want them to suffer as much as they made us suffer. We want them to be as miserable as we are. And so we go after them. Several years ago, we were told about a movie that illustrated this very well. A movie titled The Interpreter, story about a woman who worked at the United Nations in New York City as an interpreter. She originally had been born in a country in Africa that during the racial upheaval, her parents were killed, and the man responsible for killing her mother and father ultimately became the president of that country in Africa. She escaped, came to the United States, ends up as an interpreter at the United Nations. This African president now, years later, is scheduled to make a speech at the UN. The Secret Service, who will be protecting him while he's in the United States, discovers that there's a plot out to assassinate him while he's in New York. And of course, because of her history, she becomes an immediate suspect. So in this scene, the Secret Service agent has just asked her about whether or not she might be involved in this plot to assassinate the man who was responsible for her parents' murder. Huh? Listen to this.
Everyone who loses somebody wants revenge on someone on guard if they can't find anyone else. But in Africa, in Matopo, the coup believed that the only way to end grief is to save a life. If someone is murdered, a year of mourning ends with a ritual that we call the Drowning Man trial. There's an all-night party beside a river. At dawn, the killer is put in a boat, he's taken out on the water, and he's dropped. He's bound so that he can't swim. The family of the dead then has to make a choice. They can let him drown, or they can swim out and save him. The coup believe that if the family lets the killer drown, they'll have justice but spend the rest of their lives in mourning. But if they save him, if they admit that life isn't always just, that very act can take away their sorrow. Vengeance is a lazy form of grief.
I I think that's one of the best sentences that I've ever heard come out of Hollywood. Vengeance is a lazy form of grief. You avoid the reality of what happened by trying to punish the perpetrator. You displace your anger and rage by trying to take revenge. So lots of challenges for us, but the exercise is well worthwhile. Before I finish, I want to show you 2 models from these researchers, specific steps by which they suggest forgiveness can happen. Robert Enright actually in his work identifies 20 kind of sequences you go through. That's way too many for me to try to remember for us to focus on. But he has divided those into 4 sections, 4 phases. First of all, he says you uncover. You look at what happened, and you do that in such detail that it becomes clear to you what your feelings are and why they are there. Secondly, you make a decision. You choose to forgive. It's a rational, intentional decision. And third, you work hard at it. Deciding itself is not enough, he says. You've got to exert effort in trying to understand who that offender is and why this happened the way it did. And then he uses the word deepening. For me, that's part of the description of the kind of cycles that we go through, the repeated visits to this offense. Whenever it resurfaces, we reprocess things. We deal with it repeatedly over and over again in order to reinforce what we have chosen to make happen. So that's Enright's, the overview of Enright's approach. Robert Worthington in Virginia, whose mother was killed, uses an acronym, and each letter in the word REACH identifies a step toward making forgiveness work. First of all, you recall the hurt. You empathize with the offender. And then you offer them what he labels as an altruistic gift. By that he means that you treat them better than they deserve. They do not deserve this kindness, this forgiveness from you. They have not earned it. They are not worthy of this, but you give it to them anyway, even though they are undeserving. It's an altruistic gift. You commit yourself to the process. Here's the reinforcement, again, repeated reinforcement of getting there. And you hold on to forgiveness, tenaciously determined to make it happen. Well, you heard me talk about this last night. So, those steps toward making forgiveness work and happen are helpful. Before we finish, Barbara, why don't you come? We'll share some, just a quick overview of some of the resources that have been helpful to us in this general field. And then, if any of you want to pursue discussions with us, we'll be here the rest of the day and tomorrow as well. Some resources.
This is one of my favorite books, especially for children. Tear Soup is kind of almost a comic book type format, but a very good, helpful thing for children. in dealing with grief and loss. Go ahead. Forgiving Dead Man Walking is actually the story of the woman who was the victim in the movie Dead Man Walking. She was on our campus at one time. We got to meet her. She went through horrific stuff, and it's not a book for the faint of heart, I can tell you that. It's very, very descriptive of the terrible, she was raped multiple times. Her boyfriend was shot. He did not die and all of that. But in the end, she talks about all of the forgiveness that she had to do, including forgiving God. It's quite a read.
Martin Dobelmeyer, who has done a series of documentaries about Seventh-day Adventists, also has done one on forgiveness. This is an overview of the general subject, introduces you to some of the researchers, and tells several very poignant stories where forgiveness has been acted out. Do you remember years ago the assault by a distressed man who shot children in an Amish school? That story is addressed here. The situation in after 9/11 in New York City is told, etc. So it's a very good documentary on the subject of forgiveness. This is Fred Luskin's original book. He has a couple more since then, one that applies specifically to marriages and families, and I mentioned that he has some workshops as well. We have not dealt with a whole aspect of the sad, traumatic times in life, and that is the questions it raises about God. This book addresses some of those. Why is it that God lets these kinds of things happen in the first place? If God really cared about us, wouldn't He protect us from those things? And is the reality that they happen anyway, if God cares enough, is it an indication that God isn't powerful enough to stop it from happening? That debate has been going on for centuries. And Leslie Weatherhead's little book is actually a series of sermons he wrote during World War II, where he addresses how to understand a kind and caring God in a world full of pain and misery. And I have found it very helpful. This is a more recent book by an Adventist author. Richard Rice teaches at Loma Linda University. This book was published by a Christian publishing house and is used the last couple of years in a lot of college classes. It surveys the various ways in which those questions about the nature of God and why God allows suffering, various ways throughout history that those issues have been addressed, and then he describes weaknesses and strengths of each position, and at the end comes to his own description of what's most satisfactory explanations of this subject of what we call theodicy. And then you've gotten acquainted, you've heard about my book, and the last one is the workshop that colleagues and I did. This includes the presentation, so you don't have to know anything about the subject. You could either look at these by yourself or gather a group of friends around you, or in a class at church or in the community, play the DVD presentation. There's a leader's guide that has some questions for you to discuss among yourselves. And online, Pacific Press has created a free downloadable exercise book that has to do with forgiveness as well. I'm looking at the clock and wondering whether you have any comments or questions you want us to address before I have a prayer and let you all go. Okay? We will stay by if you have some of those. We want to thank you for letting us be among you this week to share the story of a good God who stays close to us in very difficult and tough times. May I pray for us all? Lord, you know each of us here. You know the burdens carried by each person in this place. I pray that you will lead each of us. Help us open ourselves to your gift of acceptance of us. Help us learn how to share that gift with other people so that others will see through us the love you offer to them. In Jesus' name, amen.